Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to talk about books that I've read recently that are structured perhaps, or the theme of which has something to do with physics. Now you may not know this to look at me, but I do enjoy reading about physics. Now when I was in high school and college, I avoided the sciences as hard as I possibly could, and still today. A lot of the basic ideas of physics, which I've read about several times, don't stick in my mind as well, perhaps, as they should. But the first book I read, which kind of connected physics and literature together, was Einstein's Dreams by Alan Lightman. This is basically a series of dreams that Lightman imagines that Einstein had, which kind of led to or illustrated some of the principles and theories he was thinking about. And I just was really enchanted by the book, and I thought it was great. And then, sometime shortly after that, I caught an episode of Brian Greene's series on PBS called The Elegant Universe. And that then kind of sent me into reading books about physics. And, I read several. I read The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene. I read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I also read The Universe in a Nutshell by Stephen Hawking. More recently, I read Lost in the Math by Sabine Hassenfelder. I read Through Two Doors at Once by Anal Anaswathani, and I read The End of Everything by Katie Mack. These are things that interest me. So I had kind of a moment of synchronicity recently when I began reading Jennifer Egan's book, A Visit from the Goon Squad, because all of a sudden, within a relatively short period of time, I had read two books which seemed to organize themselves or seem to create a plot structure which in some ways replicates issues involving quantum physics. Now the first, you may have already guessed, that I read was The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy. No, I still have not picked up or read a copy of Stella Maris. But in The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy, our main character is a man named Bobby Western. And Western at one time studied physics at Caltech before kind of dropping out, related to the death of his sister, who herself was a brilliant mathematician. Western's father worked on the Manhattan Project, so in some ways he was associated with creating the atomic bomb, and therefore we get this connection in the plot, in the book, immediately between physics and death, the combination of the two things there. At one point in the book, and this is kind of, if you've seen any of my reviews, discussions about the book, you know that one of the things I found really frustrating about the book as a novel is they're just these really long conversations that are one-sided. Mostly they're people talking to Bobby Western, but in this occasion, around the middle of the book, we get Bobby Western essentially running through the history of theories that explain perhaps why the subatomic particulate world, the quantum world, does not operate on the same set of rules as the physical world. And he talks about all these theories, beginning with Einstein. And, essentially this is just McCarthy using Bobby Western as a mouthpiece, telling us everything he knows about quantum physics. And the end result is we are left with this idea that we still don't know. There are all these theories, and different people follow these different theories, but, we still don't know. And then following that, we get Western having meetings with, or sitting down talking to lots of people who essentially kind of give him different versions, or talk to him about life and death. They talk to him about, changing identity and what it means to be a person, and, all these kind of other things, which are, in the end, we're left with, I think, this idea of McCarthy through Bobby Western exploring the ideas of life and its meaning, and death and that and its meaning, and relating it to that kind of quantum world in which the behavior of particles don't behave in the same way we would expect things to behave above the quantum level. In addition to that, and this is where the real moment of synchronicity occurred for me between The Passenger and Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad. In addition to that, I think it's safe to interpret that Bobby Western and his sister Alicia, we are intended to think about them as two particles that were once together, and that now are separated by a great distance, but somehow or another they still have are able to communicate information with one another. The distance in the book that separates Bobby Western and Robert Western from her sister is death. She's dead. And yet he still feels her presence very really across that divide, across that space. This is called attraction at a distance. And sometimes, and I'll mention this again, with Jennifer Egan's book, sometimes it's referred to, or these particles are referred to as entangled particles, where they seem to be able to communicate and know about the location of one another across great distances, even though for them to know and share that information would have to be traveling at greater than the speed of light. So I think there's a lot of physics wrapped up in the passenger. And if that's your kind of thing and you don't mind just long pages of exposition and a novel and a book about philosophy and science and the philosophy of physics and things like that masquerading as a novel, then the passenger might be for you. For me, I struggled with it as a novel. But then, just recently, one of the books that was in my cart was Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. And I didn't know that this book was also really structured, I think, around these ideas of the subatomic particulate world and quantum physics. So in A Visit from the Goon Squad, we start out with all these characters who know one another. They are connected to a band, and then they break apart. They go their separate ways. They lead very different lives. They, become distant from one another, but there still seem to be these connections that exist between them, between people or events. And they still kind of, in the end, those of them that are still alive achieve some kind of moment of unity where there are these connections between them across time, across space, across generations. And this, I think, intentionally calls to mind this idea of entangled particles. As a matter of fact, we have a character in A Visit from the Goon Squad who actually talks about this idea of entangled particles. Unlike the passenger, where there are these long passages where, essentially McCarthy's just proving to us through Bobby Western that he knows all these theories about quantum physics. Unlike that, we have a character really succinctly in just a few footnotes around the middle of the book explain to us this idea. Egan writes, I've engaged in a bit of sophistry here, suggesting that entangled particles can explain anything when to date they themselves have not been satisfactorily explained. Entangled particles are subatomic twins, photons created by splitting a single photon in half with a crystal, which still react identically to stimuli applied to only one of them, even when separated from each other by many miles. How puzzled physicists ask, can one particle possibly know what is happening to the other? There are three theoretical explanations. One, the particles are communicating. Impossible because they would have to do so at a speed faster than the speed of light, thus violating relativity theory. Two, the photons are responding to local factors engendered by their former status as a single photon. This was Einstein's explanation of the phenomenon, entangled particles, which he termed spooky action at a distance. No, because we've already established that they are not responding to each other, they are responding simultaneously. And three, it's one of those quantum mechanical mysteries. That then kind of sums up, I think, this idea of these particles that have been divided, which react to stimulus simultaneously and somehow still seem to be in communication with one another. And that is replicated in the characters that are presented in this book. We have these band members, these people who are attached, and we follow, like, in each chapter we get a story about one of the people, and then one of the characters in that chapter is carried over to the next, and we see how they're all connected, so that they seem to get further and further apart. And then near the end, a lot of them come back together. A lot of them are back in touch with one another in one way, shape, or form. And I find that to be really affecting. As much as I was put off by the way in which McCarthy kind of dealt with and wove physics into, or in my opinion, failed to effectively thread physics through his plot, I thought Egan did it brilliantly. Now again, I'm not claiming to understand all the physics involved, or even to understand necessarily all the ways in which physics is reflected in these books, but I did think it was kind of interesting, and so I thought I would make a video about it. Please leave me suggestions for other works of fiction in which physics plays perhaps a subtextual role, do you think? Even if it might be mentioned and some things might be explained, I'd like to read more of those, and I'd like to know your thoughts about the video in general. So I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.